Okay, let's go. Number 10. Centralia Mine Fire. The year is 1981. You are standing on a quiet paved street in a thriving Pennsylvania town. The sky is clear and the neighborhood feels completely normal, but the asphalt beneath your shoes feels unnervingly warm. A thin ribbon of white smoke drifts up from a slight crack in the road, and the air carries the sharp, heavy scent of burning sulfur. We build our modern cities on a very simple assumption. We believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid, passive, and entirely safe. We assume that concrete and steel guarantee permanent human settlement. We pour deep foundations, expecting the earth to simply hold them forever. But in Centralia, that familiar belief breaks down completely. The ground itself has become a lethal hazard, transforming a functioning American town into a permanent exclusion zone. When engineers from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection lowered measurement probes deep into the soil, the readings they recovered were almost impossible to comprehend. The subterranean temperature measurements did not just indicate a localized heat source. The earth directly below the surface was burning at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was so intense that it began to melt the highway from the bottom up. Lethal carbon monoxide gas started venting through the fractured pavement, silently leaking into the basements of family homes. The town was resting entirely on top of a roaring underground inferno. But the most unsettling detail of this destruction is its origin. This was not a sudden volcanic anomaly. It was not a random, unavoidable natural disaster. This was a strictly industrial accident. Human activity ignited a minor fire in an abandoned strip mine on the edge of the borough. That single spark found its way into the vast, dark labyrinth of mining tunnels running directly beneath the community. That reality shatters the illusion of modern permanence. We like to assume that our advanced urban engineering makes us immune to the landscape. But when the very foundation of a city turns into a furnace, all of that infrastructure means absolutely nothing. The surface architecture did not fail. The structural integrity of the buildings remained perfectly fine. But the earth itself turned toxic, forcing a total, permanent human retreat. The town had to be condemned, the population evacuated, and the borders sealed off. A thriving modern community was ultimately erased by the exact economic foundation it was built upon. The coal that gave this town its existence was the very same element that destroyed it. Today, the houses are completely gone. All that remains is an empty grid of cracked roads, slowly being swallowed by the surrounding forest. The surface is quiet now, but the fire is still burning right beneath it, creeping blindly through the dark, which immediately raises the next question. What kind of massive, hidden fuel source feeds a fire that simply cannot be extinguished? The answer lies in the massive anthracite coal vein. When researchers published the USGS anthracite coalfield study, they did not just document a local mineral deposit. They mapped a subterranean ocean of high-grade fuel. The coal beneath this region is incredibly dense, incredibly pure, and spread across a massive geographical footprint. It operates on a completely different physical scale than anything we interact with on the surface. To understand the fire, you have to stop thinking about a burning building. You have to start thinking about a burning mountain. And this is where our central investigation begins. The destruction of this town was not a random act of nature. It was a direct result of human engineering accidentally sparking a geological scale disaster. We dug into the earth to extract its power, hollowing out a vast network of interconnected tunnels. We built the perfect ventilation system for an underground furnace. And then, a simple industrial mistake ignited a subterranean disaster that all of our modern technology cannot extinguish. We essentially built a machine to destroy our own city. If you stand on the empty surface streets today, the problem looks small. You see a cracked highway, you see a few dead trees, you see a wisp of smoke. But if you reset your perspective to look underground, the reality of the hazard becomes much darker. The fire is slowly eating its way through the labyrinth of abandoned mining tunnels. Following the veins of coal deep into the earth, it creates massive voids that cause the surface to suddenly collapse into unpredictable sinkholes. This completely shatters our normal expectation of disaster recovery. We usually assume that fires eventually burn out when their surface fuel is exhausted, but the anthracite coal vein is so large that this fire will not stop next year. or even next decade. According to the geological data, this underground inferno has enough fuel to burn for centuries. It will easily outlast multiple human generations before the coal is finally consumed. This fact changes the entire concept of human error. We are used to treating industrial accidents as temporary problems. We assume we can clean them up, pour some new concrete, and move forward. But here, the simple version of the story breaks down entirely. One mistake did not just ruin a neighborhood. It created a permanent geological hazard. It transformed a patch of the modern map into an exclusion zone that will outlive everyone who remembers the town. The ground itself has evicted us, and it will not let us back in, but the ground is just the first boundary. If an unstoppable fire forces us to abandon our cities from below, what kind of invisible threat forces us out from the air? Number 9. Pripyat Amusement Park. The year is 1986. You are standing in the center of a gleaming modern city, looking up at a bright yellow Ferris wheel that has never carried a single passenger. The concrete plazas around you are built for a thriving population of nearly 50,000 workers, engineers, and their families. The air is entirely still, but by tomorrow afternoon, every single one of those people will be gone, and this entire urban grid will be sealed off from the rest of humanity forever. We carry a very specific, comforting belief about how human settlements fail. We assume that cities decay slowly, wearing down over centuries of economic neglect, changing borders, or shifting weather patterns. We think of ruins as ancient, fragile things, built from stone and slowly reclaimed by the long passage of time. Pripyat shatters that comforting, familiar timeline. This was not a slow, historical decline. It was a violent, overnight timeline reset. A thriving, highly advanced metropolis was transformed into a ghost town in the span of a single weekend. When you read the timeline of sudden abandonment documented in the IAEA Chernobyl Forum report, the sheer speed of the erasure is terrifying. The evacuation of this massive modern hub was not a gradual, carefully planned retreat. It was an absolute, immediate, and total mandate triggered by an invisible catastrophe. Residents were given just a few hours to pack their lives into small bags. They were told to bring only what they could carry for a temporary 3-day absence. They left half-eaten meals sitting on their kitchen tables. They left their thick winter coats hanging on the doors. They left their cars parked on the wide avenues. And they left the brand new, brightly painted amusement park waiting for a grand opening that would never, ever arrive. In a single afternoon, the ultimate illusion of human control completely shattered. Pripyat was not some fragile, ancient settlement vulnerable to the elements. It was a city specifically designed to showcase the absolute pinnacle of modern engineering, powered by the most advanced atomic technology of its era. It was built to last for generations. Yet, despite all of that poured concrete and reinforced steel, the city was instantly defeated by a threat that no one could even see, touch, or smell. That empty amusement park changes the entire narrative of the disaster. It is not just a collection of rusting metal or a sad relic of the 1980s. That pristine Ferris wheel, frozen exactly as the builders left it, serves as a permanent, instant monument to human error. It is a massive, silent physical marker of the exact day when our own industrial hubris outpaced our ability to survive it. The rides were never used, yet they will stand for centuries as a warning. This completely redefines what it means for a modern city to be destroyed. We usually look for the physical scars of war, massive impact craters, collapsed walls, or rising floodwaters. But Pripyat proves that a modern concrete empire can be instantly and permanently voided without a single building being physically knocked down. The structures remain perfectly intact, standing exactly as they were built, waiting for people who can never return. The architecture survived, but the space itself has become entirely lethal. The humans were forced into a chaotic, permanent retreat, leaving their pristine city behind. But the massive release of radiation did not just hover harmlessly over the empty asphalt. It moved with the wind. It settled. It found a completely new host outside the city limits, which leads us to an unavoidable question. Where exactly did the invisible hazard migrate to after the people fled? The hazard did not simply vanish into the atmosphere. It migrated directly into the soil and the massive stands of pine trees bordering the city, creating an entirely new kind of hazard zone, which is now known as the Red Forest. We carry a deeply ingrained, almost romantic belief about the natural world. We assume that nature immediately begins to reclaim and heal human disasters. When an industrial site is abandoned, we expect the local vegetation to grow over the concrete, scrub the air, break down the pollutants, and slowly return the land to a pure, safe state. But at Pripyat, that comforting idea is completely inverted. The forest did not heal the disaster. It acted as an immense, living biological sponge, absorbing a catastrophic volume of lethal toxicity right out of the sky. The State Agency of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management records meticulously document this exact environmental shift. According to their ongoing monitoring logs, the local flora took in the invisible fallout directly through their root systems and their needles, pulling the contamination out of the wind. The forest did not just act as a passive backdrop to a human tragedy. The trees actively captured the heavy radioactive isotopes, pulling them deep into their living cellular structure. This completely changes our perspective on the abandoned city. The primary danger was no longer confined to the decaying concrete of the reactor or the empty apartment blocks. The natural environment itself had become the ultimate physical barrier. The living landscape was transformed into a massive trap for invisible toxicity. The radiation dose was so intense that the dense pine trees literally changed color, turning a dark, rust-like red before they finally died. But even in death, the forest did not make the area safe. As the red needles and dead branches fell to the earth, they created a highly radioactive, concentrated layer on the forest floor. Nature did not clean up the human mistake. Instead, it weaponized itself against any humans who might ever try to return. Every gust of wind, every shifting root system, and every minor summer forest fire now threatens to pick up those trapped isotopes and throw them right back into the air. The toxicity absorbed by the landscape guarantees that the area cannot simply be swept clean or rebuilt. It forces a strict generational avoidance. The woods have essentially become an active warden, locking humanity out of its own territory for centuries to come. The environment is holding the poison, and it will not let it go. But if the landscape itself has become a lethal weapon, how do you contain it? Can a physical barrier actually keep out a threat that is already inside? Number 8. The concrete fortress of Hashima. The year is 1974. You are standing on the edge of a tiny, densely packed island off the coast of Japan. Around you, massive concrete apartment blocks rise up like a mechanical mountain, and ringing the entire perimeter is a towering seawall, explicitly built to keep the violent ocean out. By tomorrow, the coal mine beneath this island will close. The residents will leave, and that immense protective wall will take on an entirely different function. We carry a familiar belief about massive defensive architecture. We assume that concrete seawalls protect human settlements from natural destruction. We build them to keep the wild forces of nature at bay, ensuring that the communities inside remain safe and permanent. We view them as shields, but Hashima Island completely twists that logic. The massive seawall no longer protects the city from the ocean. Instead, it now traps a crumbling labyrinth. It has turned the abandoned island into a lethal cage of collapsing infrastructure. When engineers review the Nagasaki City Hashima Island Preservation Council records, they are not just looking at standard urban decay. They are documenting a staggering structural isolation barrier that surrounds one of the most densely packed concrete ruins on Earth. The island is crammed with 9-story apartment buildings, narrow courtyards, and heavy mining facilities, all compressed into a space roughly the size of a sports stadium. The perimeter wall was designed to be completely impenetrable. Today, that means heavy machinery cannot easily get in to stabilize the structures, and the falling debris cannot get out. The sheer density of the concrete ruin makes it incredibly dangerous to navigate. Without constant human maintenance, relentless saltwater and punishing typhoons have aggressively attacked the steel reinforcements inside the concrete. Entire building facades are peeling off. Heavy roofs are suddenly caving in, but because the seawall is doing exactly what it was originally built to do, the collapsing infrastructure is perfectly isolated. The danger is entirely contained, forced to compound on itself within a closed loop. This is where the story shifts from a natural hazard to a failure of our own design. Human engineering, deliberately built to protect life, became the exact mechanism that makes the ruins too dangerous to explore. By sealing the island off from the sea, we also sealed it off from any safe method of recovery. The barrier actively accelerates the island's internal structural destruction, holding the shattered buildings together just enough to keep them standing as a lethal hazard. The architecture meant to ensure permanence, instead engineered a permanent, lethal labyrinth. We built a fortress so strong that it eventually locked us out of our own creation. Hashima remains a physical trap, guarded by the very concrete that was meant to save it. But if a physical wall can accidentally trap a structural hazard, what happens when a danger is so absolute that physical walls are no longer enough? What happens when a town must be deliberately erased from official maps just to stop people from finding it? Number 7. The town erased from the map. The year is 2006. You are looking at an official government map of the Pilbara region in Western Australia. You run your finger along the remote dirt roads, trying to find the once thriving mining community of Wittenoom. But the grid simply dissolves into empty space. The physical buildings still exist out there in the scorching desert. The roads are still paved, but the town itself has been deliberately and permanently deleted from the cartographic record. We hold a very specific assumption about abandoned places. We assume that ghost towns remain on our maps as historical curiosities. Even when a modern settlement fails, we leave its name behind as a quiet monument to the people who lived there. We expect the geography to remember what we built, but Wittenoom breaks that familiar rule completely. This is not a case of a town slowly fading from public memory over centuries. This is an active, state-mandated deletion. If you examine the Western Australia Department of Land's map archives, you can track the exact moment the government officially stripped the town of its gazetted status. They mandated that road signs be pulled down, and that all future maps remove any reference to the coordinates. The reason for this drastic measure was an industrial catastrophe. For decades, the local economy relied heavily on extracting blue asbestos. It was a highly toxic, microscopic mineral that eventually coated the streets, filled the soil, and saturated the lungs of the workers. The lingering contamination was so widespread and so persistently lethal that the government realized they could never actually clean the environment. This realization forced a terrifying bureaucratic calculation. If the town remained on paper, simple human curiosity would inevitably draw dark tourists, urban explorers, and off-road travelers right into the invisible hazard zone. The state decided that the only way to effectively protect future generations was to ensure they never knew the place was out there at all. Erasing the memory of the town became the primary defensive strategy for keeping an uninformed public away. This completely changes our understanding of how an exclusion zone can operate. We are used to seeing danger isolated by thick concrete walls or heavily guarded military checkpoints. But here, the contamination is so absolute and so fundamentally impossible to contain that the state must literally pretend the town never existed. The physical reality of the disaster was deemed too dangerous to even acknowledge on a simple piece of paper. A functioning community of thousands of people was transformed into a permanent restricted zone, not by building a fence, but by systematically deleting its cartographic footprint. The authorities did not lock the doors to the town. They simply destroyed the directions to find it. But pulling a name off a map does not actually remove the physical hazard from the earth. The invisible blue asbestos fibers are still blowing through the empty desert streets today, which leads to an immediate vital question. If the town is entirely erased from official records, how do you stop the people who managed to stumble upon the ruins completely by accident? The answer to that question lies in a scattering of rusting metal warning signs staked into the red dirt at the edge of Wittenoom. When you approach the erased borders of the town, there is no grand barricade to stop you. There is only a quiet desert wind and a few faded steel rectangles bolted to wooden posts. The paint is peeling, and the letters are slowly bleaching out under the intense Australian sun. We carry a deeply ingrained assumption about how dangerous places are contained. We believe that lethal exclusion zones are secured by massive structural engineering. We expect to see towering concrete walls, steel gates, or military checkpoints. We assume that if a threat is severe enough to completely erase a town from an official map, the physical defenses left on the ground will be equally absolute. But the reality here is entirely different. The only defense guarding this forbidden city is fragile, degrading human text. The Western Australia Department of Health Wittenoom Management Plan documents these printed warning signs as the primary physical barrier against the hazard. The government realized that physically sealing a town of this size was impossible, and opted for the most fragile option available. There are no concrete barriers. There are no guards patrolling the perimeter. The official strategy for keeping humans alive is simply placing a sign on a dirt road, hoping a traveler reads English, and asking them to turn around. The physical mismatch between the actual threat and the chosen defense is terrifying. The ground, the abandoned houses, and the air itself are saturated with millions of microscopic, lethal blue asbestos fibers. It is an invisible, permanent cloud of contamination. The fibers will not break down in the soil or dissolve in the rain. And to hold back this microscopic dust, we have deployed a few pieces of thin sheet metal that are actively being destroyed by the weather. This contrast exposes a massive flaw in how we handle our catastrophic mistakes. We are completely capable of creating permanent lethal airborne hazards that will outlast our current civilization. But when it comes to defending the future from our actions, we rely on incredibly fragile, temporary human words. The danger we leave behind operates on a geological lifespan, but the defense we build to contain it operates on the lifespan of a cheap coat of paint. The industrial mystery of Wittenum is not sealed by concrete, steel, or military force. It is sealed entirely by a vulnerable layer of language. We created a hazard that cannot be destroyed, and we guarded it with a warning that is actively rusting away. Once those metal plates finally fall to the ground, the town will be completely open to anyone who wanders in, with nothing left to tell them they are walking into a trap. But an accidental cloud of industrial dust is only one type of invisible threat. At Wittenum, the hazard was a tragic byproduct of mining. What happens when the danger in the air is not an accident at all? What happens when the invisible threat waiting in the dirt is not industrial dust, but a deliberately engineered, weaponized organism? Number 6. The biological fortress of Vozrozhdeniya. The year is 1971. You are standing on the remote, arid shores of Vozrozhdeniya Island, located deep in the center of the Aral Sea. You are surrounded by hundreds of miles of deep, impassable water. In the distance, you can see a highly secretive military town. The perimeter is guarded, the laboratories are running at full capacity, and the air above the vast testing grid holds something entirely invisible. We carry a very comforting belief about remote islands. We assume that they are natural sanctuaries, kept strictly safe because they are isolated by vast expanses of water. We view geographic distance as a protective barrier against the chaos and danger of the modern world. But on this island, that comforting idea is completely inverted. The natural isolation of the Aral Sea was not treated as a sanctuary. It was actively weaponized. The deep water was used as a massive, naturally occurring wall to hide the open-air testing of highly lethal pathogens. In places like the asbestos mines of Western Australia, the danger was a tragic byproduct of industry. The contamination was a mistake. But here, the narrative shifts entirely. The contamination on this island was not an industrial accident. The threat was deliberately designed, manufactured, and released on purpose. The military required a testing ground so remote that their deadliest biological experiments could never accidentally escape into the general population. The Monterey Institute of International Studies Bioweapons Proliferation reports precisely detail the institutional history of this isolated Soviet test site. The documents reveal an incredibly dark reality. For decades, the island operated as a top-secret biological weapons testing facility. Scientists imported highly engineered, weaponized strains of anthrax, smallpox, and the bubonic plague. They systematically released these microscopic killers into the open air to observe their lethality. The surrounding water was strictly relied upon to act as an impenetrable quarantine zone, keeping the engineered agents permanently contained within the borders of the island. This completely changes our understanding of geographic isolation. The sheer distance from civilization was ruthlessly exploited to turn a remote piece of land into a permanent biological fortress. The water did not protect the island from humanity. It protected humanity from the terrifying things we were building on the island. A natural habitat was transformed into a massive laboratory for biological warfare, sealing the evidence far away from civilian eyes. Geographic isolation was used exclusively to hide engineered threats that easily outlive the human empires that created them. The island's greatest natural defense mechanism, its absolute removal from the rest of the world, was exactly what made it the perfect host for our deadliest human inventions. We trusted the vast inland sea to keep the poison securely contained forever, but environments are not frozen in time. Over the following decades, the Aral Sea experienced a catastrophic ecological collapse. The massive body of water began to rapidly recede, turning the deep sea into a dry, flat desert, which leads to a terrifying next question. If the highly engineered pathogens were simply buried in the dirt, what happens when the sea completely dries up and the island naturally connects to the mainland? When that deep water isolation finally broke and the island merged with the surrounding desert, the threat was not gone. The danger had simply moved underground. The soil of the island was densely saturated with weaponized anthrax spores, dumped into massive, shallow trenches by the very military that engineered them. The water was gone, but the microscopic hazard was still waiting in the dust. We hold a very specific, confident belief about how we deal with biological hazards. We assume that intense chemical cleanup permanently neutralizes any biological threat. We believe that if we bring in enough industrial bleach and modern decontamination equipment, we can scrub the earth clean and reset the landscape to a safe, zero-risk state. We think of bacteria as fragile things that can simply be washed away, but the weaponized anthrax sleeping beneath this former island shatters that comforting assumption. When the Defense Threat Reduction Agency eventually arrived to secure the abandoned site, they initiated a massive, aggressive decontamination effort. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency, Возрождение Cleanup Records, detail a severe chemical assault on the primary burial trenches. Tons of powerful calcium hypochlorite were poured directly into the earth. The explicit goal was absolute, total sterilization. But when researchers tested the deep soil long after the operation was finished, they found a deeply unsettling reality. The intense cleanup had successfully killed a massive volume of the bacteria, but it had fundamentally failed to kill all of it. A measurable fraction of the engineered spores remained entirely viable. Their hardened protective shells allowed them to sleep through the concentrated chemical baths, waiting patiently in the dark for the right conditions to wake up. The soil itself essentially remembers the weapon. It absorbed our most extreme attempts to chemically erase the hazard, and it simply held on to the microscopic trace. These spores were meticulously engineered for war. They were deliberately designed to be resilient, to survive extreme temperatures, and to fiercely resist standard chemical countermeasures. And they did exactly what they were built to do. They survived decades trapped in the harsh desert dirt, and they survived our absolute best efforts to chemically destroy them. The biological weapon transformed from a military experiment into a permanent invisible defense mechanism guarding the ruined test site. We can formally abandon the site and draw new borders on the map. We can pour thousands of gallons of chemicals into the ground and declare the containment mission over. But the microscopic weapons remain active, viable, and waiting just beneath the surface. Our deadliest biological inventions have proven that they can easily outlive our attempts to clean them up. But an invisible pathogen sleeping in the dirt is only a hazard if something happens to disturb it. What happens when the danger is not just buried quietly in the ground, but is actively destroying the ground itself? If biological traces can outlast our most extreme cleanup efforts, what happens when the physical earth completely collapses beneath a modern town? Number 5. The town that swallowed itself. We have seen how biological threats can survive in the dirt, but there is a different kind of industrial hazard, one that does not just hide in the soil, but destroys the earth entirely. The year is 2006. You are standing at the edge of Peacher, Oklahoma. In every direction, massive mountains of gray gravel rise against the sky, towering over empty streets. These are the chat piles. They are artificial hills made from millions of tons of toxic mining waste, left completely exposed to the wind. But the toxic dust blowing off those peaks is only half the story. The real danger is opening up directly beneath your feet. We hold a very basic belief about the places we live. We assume that solid ground provides a permanent foundation for human settlement. We might worry about severe storms or economic collapse, but we expect the physical earth to remain intact. We build our homes, trusting that the dirt will hold them up. But in Peacher, that fundamental contract between a city and its geology was completely shattered. For decades, industrial lead and zinc mining relentlessly hollowed out the earth beneath the community. The extraction carved out a vast, unseen labyrinth of structural voids directly under the neighborhoods. The town was quietly resting on a fragile, paper-thin crust of rock, and eventually, that crust began to fail. When the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, stepped in, they found a crisis that could not be engineered away. They published a Superfund record of decision for the Tar Creek area, and the mandate was absolute. The town was not just suffering from extreme lead toxicity. The actual physical geology was giving way. Sudden, massive sinkholes were randomly opening up across the landscape, threatening to drop entire blocks of homes into flooded mine shafts below. The government realized no amount of cleanup could fix a broken foundation. They ordered a total federal evacuation, forcing the residents to leave forever. The town was not just poisoned by its own industry. The ground itself literally opened up and swallowed the community. We are used to thinking of contamination as an invisible chemical problem, something that can eventually be scraped away or capped with concrete. But the failure here was structural and absolute. The earth was so fatally undermined by human hands that it could no longer support the weight of human existence. Industrial mining did not just create a temporary environmental hazard, it created a permanent geological barrier to our return. The complete destruction of the earth beneath Peacher ensures that no one can ever rebuild on this map. The town is gone, and the foundation it stood on has been physically deleted. When a community is erased by the collapse of its own geography, the physical evidence of the people who live there is often destroyed with it, which leads to a critical next question. If geological collapse forces absolute abandonment, how do we preserve the memory of sudden human destruction? Number 4. The Frozen Massacre. The year is 2024. You are walking down the main street of Oradour-sur-Glane, a ruined village in the heart of France. The road beneath your feet is dead and empty. The stone walls around you are scorched, hollow, and completely missing their roofs. But the most jarring detail is not the broken architecture. It is the heavy, rusted metal scattered along the gutters and driveways. Corroded mid-century cars are sitting in the exact spots where their owners parked them on a bright Saturday afternoon in 1944. The tires have burned away, but the steel frames remain bolted to the earth. When we encounter an abandoned human settlement, we are deeply conditioned to view it as a traditional ruin. We assume that the place simply surrendered to shifting economic tides, changing borders, or the slow, quiet erosion of the weather. We think of ruins as dead spaces, slowly and peacefully decomposing under the open sky. But Oradour-sur-Glane shatters that familiar belief completely. You are not walking through a normal ruin. You are standing in the middle of a massive, open-air crime scene that has been intentionally and artificially frozen by time. The historical records preserved in the Centre de la Mémoire d'Oradour archives document the exact hour this community was violently erased. On the 10th of June, 1944, an armed military unit surrounded the remote village. In a matter of hours, they massacred 642 men, women, and children, and then systematically set the entire town on fire. When the smoke finally cleared days later, the state and the survivors made a radical decision. The landscape would not be swept clean, the charred sewing machines resting on stone tables, the twisted steel of the abandoned bicycles, and the burned-out cars parked on the street were left exactly where they lay on the day the violence stopped. There is a massive, unsettling difference between a town that slowly empties out over a century and a town that is murdered in a single afternoon. Natural atmospheric decay creates a sense of peaceful reclamation. The wind blows, the rain washes the streets, the roofs cave in, and the surrounding forest slowly reclaims the stone. It feels like a natural, acceptable cycle. But a sudden, violent human erasure leaves a ragged, highly unnatural edge. The physical environment here does not look like it died quietly. It looks like the local timeline simply shattered, leaving all of its physical artifacts stranded in the exact second the clock stopped. That is the strange, heavy pressure of this specific exclusion zone. The rusted cars remain precisely where they were parked, not because nobody bothered to tow them away, but as a deliberate choice to prevent the timeline from ever moving forward. The iron frames, the scorched engine blocks, and the melted glass are treated as untouchable relics. The community refuses to let the space heal, deliberately maintaining the open wounds of the streets. These everyday objects serve as permanent, frozen forensic evidence of human atrocity. They physically lock the modern viewer into the exact moment of a community's violent end. By keeping the cars exactly where they burned, the site physically prevents the world from moving on and leaving the past behind. It proves that the destruction was not a myth, not a gradual decline, but a sudden, absolute reality that erased hundreds of lives in a single day. But iron naturally rusts, and physical metal eventually dissolves into dust under decades of rain and winter snow. If the physical artifacts themselves are slowly fading, how do you guarantee that the memory of this specific erasure is never altered or denied? What kind of absolute legal power is required to force a ruined town to stay exactly the way it is forever? The answer is a piece of paper, specifically a preservation decree issued by the French Ministry of Culture. When you stand at the edge of the martyr village today, you do not see a massive perimeter fence or a concrete wall. You see physical plaques bolted to the surviving stone, enforcing a strict and absolute legal mandate. We usually think of exclusion zones as places secured by physical barricades made of steel, barbed wire, or heavy earth. We expect a wall to physically stop the modern world from entering. But here, bureaucratic paperwork functions as an impenetrable physical barrier. A legal signature in a distant government office stops bulldozers, architects, and construction crews just as effectively as a military blockade. The decree dictates a very specific, highly unnatural state of existence. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane must remain exactly as they were left on that afternoon in 1944. No fallen roof tile can be cleared away, no scorched wall can be plastered over, no shattered window can be replaced, and none of the rusted mid-century cars can ever be towed away. The state has legally mandated that the village must continue to exist in a permanent, open-air state of violent destruction. The law has frozen the decay in place. This goes against every standard human instinct. After a catastrophic disaster, the immediate, overwhelming impulse of any surviving community is to sweep away the debris, lay fresh foundations, and move forward. We heal by rebuilding. We bury our tragedies under new architecture and clean streets. We want to erase the visual evidence of our vulnerability. But at Oradour-sur-Glane, that deeply ingrained reflex is actively blocked by the state. The government has ordered the town to simply sit in the elements, exposed and broken. The realization here is unsettling. Recovery is not just delayed by a lack of funding or a stalled development plan. Recovery is legally forbidden. The natural progression of time has been outlawed. Sometimes, the only way to genuinely honor a tragedy is to legally forbid anyone from ever cleaning it up. The physical plaques and the preservation mandates act as a permanent textual history, standing guard over the silent streets. They ensure that even as the physical artifacts slowly lose their shape to the weather, the exact forensic details of the massacre remain locked in the official record. The law forces the memory of the event to survive long after the physical iron finally dissolves into the earth. But a legal decree relies entirely on human beings choosing to respect the law. It is an invisible border made of words and shared memory, which leads us to a much harsher reality. If a simple piece of paper and a bronze plaque can freeze a rural village in time, what happens when raw military force is used to permanently seal off a massive, modern luxury city? Number 3. The Varosha barbed wire. The year is 2024. You are standing on the Mediterranean coast of Cyprus, looking out over the edge of the Varosha Resort District. The sand beneath your feet is pristine. The ocean water is incredibly clear. But right in front of you, cutting straight across the bright tourist beach and slicing deep into the city, is a tangled wall of rusted barbed wire. You are standing at the absolute limit of the United Nations buffer zone. We normally think of a military checkpoint as a temporary security measure. We view borders as places where passports are checked, cargo is searched, and people eventually pass through. We assume that wire and armed guards are meant to regulate human movement. But this specific military border operates very differently. It acts as the heavy, impenetrable seal on a massive urban time capsule. The barrier here does not manage traffic. It forbids it entirely. It locks a sprawling luxury space into a permanent state of suspended animation. This absolute freeze began in the summer of 1974. A sudden military invasion violently divided the island. The residents of Varosha, which was then one of the most glamorous and booming luxury resort districts in the world, fled their homes and hotels in a matter of hours. They expected to return in a few days once the fighting stopped, but they never came back. The United Nations peacekeeping force stepped in to enforce a strict, heavily militarized exclusion line in order to prevent further violence. Over the decades, that temporary buffer zone hardened into an absolute mandate. For half a century, the UN mandate has kept the original residents permanently locked out. Heavily armed peacekeepers became the accidental guardians of an empty ghost city. We are deeply conditioned to believe that forbidden cities are created by overwhelming physical forces. We expect our ruins to be the result of ancient traps, extreme weather, or massive natural disasters. We assume that modern exclusion zones must be carved out by toxic spills or invisible radiation. But Varosha represents a completely different kind of erasure. This is a completely artificial, politically enforced dead zone. The ground here is not poisoned. There is no radiation leaking into the soil. There is no biological weapon drifting through the sea breeze. The physical environment is perfectly safe for human life. The only reason this sprawling district remains a lethal exclusion zone is because heavily armed guards are actively ordered to enforce an absolute human absence. The danger is not natural at all. The danger is us. Human conflict creates permanent artificial dead zones that easily outlast the original battles that sparked them. The ongoing political stalemate transformed a simple perimeter of barbed wire into a modern preservation mechanism. It froze an entire era of human life exactly where it stood, trapping everything from car dealerships to high-rise hotels behind a wall of military force. But freezing a city politically is not the same as preserving it physically. The barbed wire successfully keeps the people out, but it cannot stop the slow, relentless machinery of time, which leads to an unavoidable next question. What exactly happens to the towering concrete and steel of modern luxury architecture when it is locked inside the wire and left completely without human maintenance for 50 years? If you look closely past that rusted wire today, the answer is a slow, overwhelming structural collapse. The skyline of Varosha is still dominated by massive resort hotels, but they are entirely hollowed out. The luxury balconies are stripped bare, the panoramic windows are completely shattered, and the grand cavernous lobbies are choked with wild, overgrown vegetation. 50 years of absolute neglect has turned the Mediterranean's most glamorous tourist destination into a towering, highly unstable ghost town. We hold a very confident, almost arrogant assumption about the things we build today. When we look at ancient Roman aqueducts or classical stone temples, we see architecture that has survived for thousands of years entirely without us. Because we use advanced steel and reinforced concrete, we naturally assume that our modern buildings must be infinitely stronger. We think of our modern high-rises as permanent artificial mountains. But modern concrete behaves very differently than ancient stacked stone. Ancient stone rests passively on the earth, slowly weathering the centuries. Modern concrete, however, requires constant, active human intervention just to survive its own environment. According to detailed status reports compiled by the Cyprus Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the structural integrity of these luxury sectors is actively failing across the board. The corrosive salt air from the ocean easily penetrates the porous concrete, eventually reaching the iron rebar buried deep inside. As that internal steel rusts, it expands. It systematically shatters the concrete columns from the inside out. Without maintenance crews constantly patching the microfractures and painting the exposed metal, the buildings are quite literally tearing themselves apart. It is a profound shift in scale and purpose. A sprawling coastal district designed purely for extreme human comfort and leisure has become a lethal hazard of falling debris in just a few short decades. The lavish swimming pools are cracked and filled with weeds, and the multi-story hotels are slowly collapsing under their own massive, unmaintained weight. This reveals a strange, uncomfortable reality about modern engineering. Our most advanced structures are actually incredibly fragile if we simply stop taking care of them. The illusion of urban permanence only exists as long as we are there to constantly repair the daily damage. The exact moment we are locked out by a military border, the buildings immediately begin to die. Nature reclaims our modern urban sites exponentially faster than it reclaims ancient ruins. We have built a vast concrete empire that simply cannot survive without us standing guard over it. But the slow structural decay of a coastal city still takes several decades to complete. What happens when the destruction of a modern settlement is not a slow process of rust and salt at all? Can absolute geological forces erase a thriving modern city even faster than urban decay? Number 2. The Plymouth Ash Burials. The year is 1997. You are standing on a remote island in the Caribbean, but you are not looking at white sand or clear water. You are standing on a vast, silent plain of solid, gray volcanic ash. And directly beneath your boots, buried under 40 feet of that hardened rock, are the crushed roofs of a thriving modern capital city. When we hear stories of entire communities being buried by a volcano, our minds immediately go to ancient Pompeii. We treat the idea of a city being swallowed alive as a historical curiosity, a tragedy reserved for people in the distant past who did not understand the earth beneath them. We hold a very comfortable assumption that our modern capitals, built with deep concrete foundations and advanced infrastructure, are completely immune to sudden geological erasure. We believe that if a modern city is destroyed, it must happen slowly. But the official eruption logs from the Montserrat Volcano Observatory document a terrifyingly modern reality. The Soufriere Hills volcano did not just erupt once. It released massive, superheated flows of rock, gas, and mud directly into the center of Plymouth over a series of catastrophic surges. The geological measurements taken by the observatory did not just record a heavy dusting of debris. They recorded a dense, suffocating layer of ash measuring more than 40 feet deep. This was not a slow, creeping process of urban decay like the rusted hotels of the Mediterranean. This was an instant, overwhelming physical deletion of a working hub. The reality of Plymouth creates a sharp turn in how we understand modern ruins. The city was not just evacuated and left to rot in the sun. It was physically sealed. The sheer weight and intense heat of the volcanic material baked and hardened over the government buildings, the schools, and the central banks, locking the entire urban grid under an immovable shell of earth. Geological forces can still permanently erase modern human settlements in the blink of an eye. Plymouth exists today as a true modern Pompeii. It is a city permanently sealed from human access, proving that no matter how complex our architecture becomes, the Earth can still simply pave over our greatest engineering efforts whenever it decides to wake up. A 40-foot layer of solid volcanic rock is an absolute, undeniable physical barrier. It is a wall of Earth that physically stops anyone from returning home. But what happens when the force keeping us out of a city has no mass at all? What happens when the ultimate barrier sealing a modern exclusion zone is completely invisible? Number 1. The Fukushima Exclusion Zone. The year is 2011. You are walking through the aisles of a perfectly intact modern supermarket in the Fukushima prefecture. The shelves are still fully stocked with packaged food, cosmetics, and daily supplies. The magazines on the rack are all dated for the same week in March. The fluorescent lights overhead are dark, but the floors are clean, and the glass storefront is completely unbroken. It looks like the store simply closed for the night, waiting for the morning shift to unlock the doors. But if you stand in this aisle, you are absorbing a continuous invisible hazard. You are inside a town that has been completely abandoned, sealed off from the rest of the world without a single brick falling out of place. We hold a fundamental, comforting belief about what it takes to keep human beings out of a forbidden place. When we look at the ruins of Plymouth, we see 40 feet of solid volcanic ash. When we look at the coastal resorts of Varosha, we see a massive military blockade made of rusted barbed wire and concrete. We expect a permanent exclusion zone to rely on a physical, undeniable barrier, a towering wall of earth, a collapsed foundation, or a heavily armed guard. We assume that if a modern city is structurally pristine, it must be perfectly safe to enter. But this quiet supermarket is surrounded by a wall you cannot see, cannot touch, and absolutely cannot cross. The Japan Atomic Energy Agency maintains an extensive network of environmental monitoring data across this entire region. Their sensors track exactly what the human eye completely misses. The highly detailed readouts reveal that microscopic radioactive isotopes blanketed the area, binding themselves to the asphalt, the rooftops, and the surrounding forests. The data shows that the air and the soil are emitting continuous levels of radiation that make long-term human habitation biologically impossible. The hazard thoroughly saturated the pristine environment, turning the very fabric of the town into a quiet, heavily monitored weapon. This changes the entire geometry of how a modern city dies. The buildings here did not collapse under their own weight from decades of neglect, and the ground did not suddenly swallow them alive. Instead, the town was perfectly preserved by a highly lethal, completely artificial dead zone. Our most advanced technological achievement, the ability to harness and split the atom, did not just suffer a temporary failure. It created the most impenetrable, invisible barrier in human history. Invisible radiation now acts as a permanent preservation mechanism, freezing these modern ruins in a state of eerie, untouchable perfection. But an invisible airborne threat still leaves massive physical consequences on the ground. If the radiation has permanently bonded to the dirt, the grass, and the streets, you cannot just wash it away with an industrial hose. You have to physically scrape away and remove the toxic earth itself, which leads to a massive, unavoidable next question. If an entire region is heavily contaminated by an invisible failure, where exactly do you put millions of tons of poisoned soil just to survive standing next to it? The answer is waiting in the open fields just outside the empty towns. If you look at the horizon today, you do not see natural farmland or recovering forests. You see millions of identical black bags. They are stacked in endless methodical rows, forming massive artificial hills that stretch out as far as the eye can see. Each bag holds roughly 1 cubic meter of earth. We use a very comforting clinical word for this massive industrial process. We call it decontamination. It sounds like a sophisticated, high-tech erasure of the threat. It implies that the poison is simply being neutralized and dissolved into nothing. But in reality, decontamination is not not a magic scientific process. It is just the brutal, physical labor of scraping up toxic dirt, sealing it in heavy plastic, and moving it from one place to another. The sheer scale of this logistical nightmare is documented in the Japan Ministry of the Environment remediation reports. These official logs meticulously inventory an effort that defies normal human comprehension. Legions of workers have systematically shaved off the top layer of the Earth across entire regions, filling tens of millions of these heavy black bags with the irradiated topsoil of Fukushima. The reports track a frantic, exhausting campaign to physically separate the contaminated ground from the people who used to walk on it. We hold a persistent, arrogant belief that modern engineering can fix any environmental mistake. We assume that if we spend enough money and deploy enough heavy machinery, we can always scrub the landscape clean and return it to a safe, zero-risk state. But the physical reality of these black fields completely shatters that illusion. You cannot actually clean irradiated dirt. You cannot wash it, you cannot burn it, and you cannot chemically neutralize it. You can only dig it up, trap it in a thick synthetic membrane, and stack it somewhere else. And eventually, a densely populated country simply runs out of places to hide its own poisoned earth. This is where the grand promise of human recovery completely breaks down. We have not actually solved the problem, and we have not reclaimed the landscape. We have simply been forced to physically bag and stockpile our own ground, just so we can occasionally survive standing near it. The endless rows of black plastic sitting under the sun are not a temporary storage solution. They represent a physical, permanent monument to our absolute inability to fix what we broke. By trying to clean up our ultimate technological disaster, we have inadvertently created a completely new geological layer made entirely of bagged human failure. Fukushima is a massive, highly visible scar, but it is just one piece of a much wider pattern of modern human abandonment. If our most advanced technological efforts cannot actually heal the Earth, but can only trap our mistakes in endless rows of plastic, it forces a terrifying final question. If we cannot clean the ground, how much of the global map are we permanently losing? If you pull back from the black bags of Fukushima, past the volcanic ash of Plymouth, and beyond the barbed wire of Varosha, a much larger global pattern begins to emerge. Aggregate data mapping the total square mileage of modern human exclusion zones reveals a terrifying statistic. Thousands of square miles of the Earth are now officially classified as permanently uninhabitable, and that number is actively expanding. We are watching the creation of a shadow geography. This is a parallel map of the world made entirely of dead zones, restricted sectors, and lethal borders. While we build new high-rise apartments and pour fresh concrete for our highways, this shadow map quietly grows right alongside us. It is a vast, interconnected network of human retreat, stitched together by fragile warning signs and military checkpoints. Look at the complete picture of what we have left behind. We ignited an underground coal fire in Pennsylvania that will outlast multiple human generations. We built an amusement park in Pripyat that was permanently poisoned by invisible radiation in a single afternoon. We relied on a massive concrete seawall at Hashima Island, only to watch that exact engineering trap a decaying labyrinth of collapsing infrastructure. We pulled blue asbestos out of the Australian dirt until the state literally erased the town of Wittenoom from official maps. We bred anthrax spores that survived extreme chemical decontamination at the Aral Sea. We undermined the bedrock of Peicher until the town swallowed itself. We froze the forensic evidence of a 1944 massacre in France behind an absolute legal decree. We let political stalemate rot the luxury resort hotels of Cyprus. We watched a volcano instantly bury a modern Caribbean capital under 40 feet of gray rock. And finally, we sealed off entire Japanese towns with an invisible wall of radiation, leaving us with millions of black bags holding toxic dirt that has nowhere to go. We hold an arrogant belief about the trajectory of civilization. We assume that human expansion across the globe is continuous and unstoppable. We believe that mastering steel and atomic energy means we will always move forward, claiming new territory. But the shadow map proves the exact opposite. The reality is a story of sudden, permanent retreat. We are not just losing ground to natural disasters. We are quietly drawing borders against our own creations. We are building invisible walls to protect ourselves from the very technology that was supposed to guarantee our survival. In our relentless drive to master the environment, we have accidentally engineered the exact mechanisms that lock us out of our own world. The ultimate lesson of these 10 exclusion zones is not just that accidents happen. The lesson is that our modern concrete empires are fragile and easily erased. A thriving city built with the most advanced materials on Earth can be permanently destroyed in a matter of hours. We are not as permanent as we think we are. If this investigation changed how you see the ground beneath your feet, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel for more evidence of the strange patterns hiding in plain sight. Then, look around you. Go to the comments and tell me your exact location, the current time, and the place you are sitting right now. Because every permanent exclusion zone started as a normal, quiet room, just like yours.